hanging around. Kids got alligator blood.
Self-help in the age of neoliberalism. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm interested in psychology, self-help, behavioral psychology, spirituality. I mean, you've heard the words, all that stuff. And I'm always interested in some form of self-improvement, some kind of a new way of thinking, a new mindset, and so on. It's especially important if you're in the kind of entertainment industry, if you're in the arts and you're part of the creative cultural sector. The reason it's especially important is because the creative cultural sector, people like me and those who are starting out, the only way you can get involved in the creative cultural sector is by being exploited and or working for free, which is more or less the same thing. But you're basically working for free, or for nothing, which is, I feel like, two different things. Meaning you're not making a living doing it, and you can't make a living doing it. And yet at the same time, you are buying gear, you're buying products, and you're working, in a sense, within the system. And you're, like I just bought a microphone for this podcast, and it's not cheap. And so somebody's making money off of what I'm doing, but I'm not making any money. And so you kind of have to take the long view and just hope that if you do something long enough, eventually you will manage to make a living doing it. But in other words, everybody in the creative cultural sector kind of has to deal with this. And there are no easy solutions to it, but either way, you're sort of being exploited. Even when you do make it, the amount of money being made off of you is a lot more than what you get in return. If you ask any musician or songwriter, they'll tell you. I mean, if you just look at the history of contracts and how contracts are negotiated, they're essentially designed to exploit artists. And when you're starting out, you have almost no leverage, no negotiating power. So you kind of have to accept exploitation, and the rest of society goes along with it. And that's just one area of exploitation. There's still other areas, like if you're working at Walmart and you're earning a minimum wage and you're basically not earning a living wage. So this is the era of neoliberalism. And basically, neoliberalism is the idea that we're progressing according to liberal values. But part of neoliberalism, and the way I use the word, is the way a lot of critics do, which is neoliberalism is basically conservatism disguised as liberalism. So it's policies that are called progress, but in reality are contributing to the shrinking of the middle class. So there's some history involved here which I won't get into. But basically, the history starts in the early 70s, and it's people like Nixon, Reagan, and to some extent, Trudeau here in Canada. But I mean, it was a widespread phenomenon where this kind of laissez-faire economics is designed to make people think things are advancing by sort of like an unrestricted free market system. The problem, and creating a language that makes people feel like everything is going according to plan, creating this an ideology that makes people think, wow, things are really terrific here. But in reality, so there's a difference between the language of progress and the reality. And so the language makes everyone, when we talk of the countries we live in, like Canada or the United States, we tend to talk like, man, things are great here, without really paying attention to the more obvious trends. And the trends are that the middle class is shrinking. And it's not by accident. It's a result of the kind of economic policies that have been introduced here. And in general, in the sort of so-called developed nations. And they're developed obviously in some respects. But the problem is that there is a clear trend of a shrinking middle class. So when you have a shrinking middle class, you basically have an expanding population of poor people, an expanding population of people that can't afford their own way of life anymore. And that's essentially, I mean, in a nutshell, at a definitional level, that's neoliberalism. And so this trend of the shrinking middle class ought to upset more people because it is a very severe problem, and it ought to create a lot of concern in people. And the fact that it doesn't, I think, is part of the neoliberal paradigm, which is to talk like things are better than what they actually are. And this goes right into my point about self-help books. When you read self-help books, my problem with them is I think it is important to cultivate a healthy mindset. But part of that healthy mindset has to be rooted in reality. So how do you develop a positive mindset when the middle class is shrinking and you're being exploited at the creative and cultural level? How do you develop a mindset that's positive when your reality isn't positive? There's a line in an Eminem song, the first Eminem EP, where he says, "How am I supposed to be positive when I don't see shit positive?" And I think that's the true core dilemma of being part of the creative sector and being part of, essentially, you're poor or you're negotiating with poverty on some level, and you're being exploited, and then you're also being told, hey, be positive, which is such a crock of shit when you're dealing with this reality. When you're dealing with a reality where there is a shrinking middle class, and that means that if this trend continues, and we have no reason to believe it's going to change, is if this trend continues, you're just going to become a banana republic at some point if it continues. And we shouldn't take for granted the idea of progress. We shouldn't just assume it's happening. We have to actively be involved in the direction the country takes. And there's certainly the 1% are not that interested in any of us being actively involved in the direction that a country takes, because it's clearly in their best interest to have a shrinking middle class. Then you become increasingly dependent on the conditions that are being served to you, and you're increasingly powerless to do anything about it. Because let's face it, if I'm in difficult circumstances and I have $1 billion, I can afford to get out of those difficult circumstances for the most part. But if I'm in difficult circumstances and I have very little money, I'm very restricted in what I can and can't do. And so, freedom is relative to your bank account. And so all of these things are sort of ignored in self-help books. You never see self-help books talking about your political and economic reality. You never hear self-help gurus talk about politics and economics at a material ground level. It's often discussed. Self-help and positivity is talked in such abstract terms as to render invisible the increasingly problematic trends. And so a lot of my response to it is always, I don't know, partly I just want to sort of slap some sense into these so-called self-help gurus, because they live in this bubble. And they live in this bubble of a positive self-talk independently of what's actually going on. It's kind of like a cult. If you ever see documentaries on people who are members of a cult, and you can see there's like an emptiness there in their eyes. There's this sort of blank stare. It's kind of like what I imagine I look like when I'm watching a television commercial. It's just like there's an emptiness going on there. It's because it's your only way of dealing with things in a way. It's like you can't live your life constantly fighting the relentlessness of mass media commercialism. And so you're constantly put in this position of being told to be happy while the facts are not happy. The facts are not positive. So how does anybody kind of deal with that? And I think maybe I'm idealistic or naive. I do think there's room for positivity, but it has to be positivity within the context of what's actually happening. And I would love to see somebody come along and talk about being positive and being sort of in a healthy mindset without deluding yourself as to what's really going on, without deluding yourself as to the fact that you're being exploited. And I'd love to see at least one so-called self-help guru actually tell it like it is and not lie to you about your condition and not try to tell you, not infantilize you by saying, oh, well, you just need to change your mindset. It's like, look, the circumstances are not positive, and they're just, especially when you're part of the working class, when you're one of the poor, which every artist, the vast majority of them are part of it, are part of that problem. And so it's not as simple as just telling people to change their mindset. It's more complicated than that, because you need to have negative feelings about something in order to want to change it. If you feel only good about your circumstances, you don't create the you don't create the you don't have you sort of need that emotional, I don't know what the word is, but motor to propel you from one point to another. It's sort of like your gasoline in a way. Maybe, I don't know, I'm mixing my metaphors, but I think you kind of get what I'm trying to say, which is you need something as a catalyst. And if you're only in a positive state, you're not likely to change anything. But at the same time, you can't be too thrilled about the fact that you're in a negative state to begin with either. So it's not simple. It's not simply a matter of just being positive. And without some negativity, it seems like you're in a delusional state. You're sort of like a happy idiot. But at the same time, you don't want to be somebody who's just perpetually morose. So I don't know what the solution is, and that's partly why I'm talking about it, because um, uh, maybe there are people who have an insight into this problem that I don't have, that I'd love to hear. And maybe that's a conversation I could have with people in psychology, for instance, because I'd really like to get their feedback on it. And here's another problem. If you study psychology, you generally don't study politics or economics. And if you're studying politics and economics, you're not really studying psychology. Even when you're doing like a double major, it's not as if the textbooks themselves combine the topics. When you're studying economics, for the most part, you're not really studying psych, and vice versa. And I think that's a huge problem, because when you talk to a political science major, any problem is political. And they sort of look at you, and it's happened to me where you talk to a political science major, and when you want to address a psychological problem, like somebody there is such thing as someone who's only looking for the negative in a situation. And there is a certain pathology to that. And there are things that you can sort of work on improving on your own. But the problem is it's not only that. There are circumstances where your conditions are negative, and so it's not a psychological problem. In fact, being unhappy could be the sign of a very healthy mind. It's a sign of somebody who's accurately assessing the reality of their situation, and the reality of their situation is a negative one. And so the only sane response is to be unhappy. So where do you draw the line? And then a political science major will often, at least in my experience, and I suspect that this is true generally, that you talk to a political science major and the problem is political. You talk to a psychology major and the problem is psychological. Talk to an economics major, problem is economic. What's your bank account look like? How much money do you have or don't? And so in a way, I can kind of understand everybody's perspective, but part of the problem becomes people become a bit myopic and they don't see the relationship between things. So I guess what I'm getting at is I'd love to see somebody deal with psychology within the context of politics and economics, and vice versa. Look at politics and economics within the context of psychology and what the relationship is. And it's never clear or obvious. But definitely like to see a lot of less of that self-help bullshit that's going on, of constantly telling you that you need to, it's sort of like smile and shut the fuck up. It's too much of that. It's too much of, the problem isn't your political and economic situation, it's you. And that is a very unhealthy thing to tell people. It's a very unhealthy mindset. And so the people that are trying to help you are actually hurting you. The people that are trying to give you a healthy mindset are actually giving you an unhealthy mindset. So there's a I don't know, a lot of smoke and mirrors, or I don't know how to say it, but there's a bizarro world effect going on of words meaning the actual opposite. You know what I mean? So what we call good is actually bad, and what we call bad is actually good. And so there's a lot of that going on. So it's very hard to parse through all that bullshit. It's very hard to, you don't know where to turn. And that's how I feel sometimes. Like I don't know exactly where to turn or who to trust. Because sometimes I think I'll look at a self-help thinker and I'll be like, that's a good point. And then they'll proceed into saying a bunch of idiotic nonsense. And then it's like, well, I don't want any of that shit. And I don't want to read a book where I'm only taking in 1% of it, and the other 99% is garbage or useless. And right now, that's where the self-help industry is. It gives you a lot of crap, a lot of garbage, a lot of pseudoscience. But a lot of it is really underneath it all. It's essentially blaming you for your problems, and that your only way out of it is by just, puckering up. And that cannot be the end point of self-help. It just cannot be. There has to be a way to learn how to regulate your thoughts and your emotions in a healthy way, learn how to find some sort of inner harmony that's genuine, without being in denial. That's what I'm hoping for. And certainly in the future, I'd love to kind of explore that idea. Basically self-help in the age of neoliberalism. It's like, how do we find a healthy mindset given these startling negative trends that we ought to be startled by, and we ought to feel like it's very problematic. And so anyway, if you have any thoughts, questions, I'd love to hear it, so long as it's well thought out. I'm not going to respond to dumb trolls. But I hope that's a conversation I'm interested in having.